Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change in Reading on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of the clear starry sky over the houses opposite the train station. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. First of all, do you know where Bath is? It's in England. It's not actually taking a bath. Kind of important. All right, so it's in England. Excuse me, he said, but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here? Try the Bell and the Dragon, the porter replied, pointing down the road. They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile along on the other side. Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid town. Find your own lodgings, he said, and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've gotten yourself settled. Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at the head office were absolutely, fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. What does brisk mean? What do you think that means? Yeah.
Elegant?
Elegant would be a good guess because all the businessmen were elegant. But if he's walking briskly. Confident and quickly. It's like everything is done quickly. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along. Only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brightly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund. And here it says a dachshund is a breed of dog that has long body, short legs, and droopy ears. Okay? A pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano, and a big sofa, and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper too. He had stayed a couple nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this, in the cold, for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go. And now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it said. Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her into the house was extraordinarily strong. I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know." "I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold?" "How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay. "If that's too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 pence less without the egg." 5 and 6 pence is fine," he answered. "I should like it very much to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." And here's a picture. There she is, and there he is. Yeah, it's a very interesting style, isn't it? She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat." There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest. The old girl is slightly dotty." Do you know what dotty means? What do you think it means? No. Little crazy. It's a little crazy, Billy told himself right here. "But at 5 and 6 pence a night, who cares about that? I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am, of course I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you see what I mean." "Ah, yes. But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure, when now and again I open the door and see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body to his feet and then up again. On the second floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up another flight. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, right? Or isn't it?" "No," he said, "it's Weaver." "Mr. Weaver, how nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. Such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly. Thank you, Billy said. Thank you ever so much. He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. I'm so glad you appeared, she said, looking earnestly into his face. I was beginning to get worried. That's all right, Billy said brightly. You mustn't worry about me. He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here? I'm not a bit hungry, thank you, he said. I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office. Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack, but before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage of the proceedings, do we? She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker, do you know what that means, off her rocker, if you say someone's off their rocker? Little crazy. A little crazy. Didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she's not only was harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that and had never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping soundly in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit of all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his name on the page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. That's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was it a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now that he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Such charming boys, a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that odd? Maybe it was in the newspapers? They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that? Famous, she said, setting the tea down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh, no, I don't think they were famous. But they were incredibly handsome, both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear. Just exactly like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noticing the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. Is it? Or it is? Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland's name is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years old.